7 marriages, 5 women. One of the most explosive, brilliant, and self-destructive men in the history of American comedy. Richard Pryor didn't just perform chaos, he lived it. He married women he loved and hurt them. He married women he barely knew. He married the same woman twice, and then did it with another woman too. He was shot at, sued, left for dead, and still managed to make the audience laugh. The story of his marriages is the story of a man who couldn't escape the damage he carried, no matter how many times he started over. Peoria and the making of a wounded man. Before there were 7 marriages, there was a boy in Peoria, Illinois, who grew up in circumstances that would have broken most people permanently. Richard Franklin Lennox Thomas Pryor was born on December 1st, 1940, in Peoria, Illinois. He was raised in a brothel. His grandmother, Marie Carter, ran the establishment. Not just one, but eventually 2 brothels, along with a nightclub and a pub on Peoria's North Washington Street. His mother, Gertrude Thomas, worked in the house as a prostitute. His father, Leroy Pryor, acted as a solicitor for the operation, the person who brought in clients. This was not a rough neighborhood used as metaphor. This was the literal structure of the household Richard Pryor grew up inside. A business built around the sale of intimacy, staffed by family members, operating in the specific social ecosystem of a mid-century Midwestern red light district. He was one of several children in the household. He witnessed things that no child should witness. In his autobiography, Pryor Convictions, he described himself as a skinny little black kid with big eyes that took in the whole world, and a wide smile that begged for more attention than anyone had time to give. The description is precise. He was a child trying to be seen in an environment organized entirely around other things. His mother eventually left when Richard was around 5 years old, fleeing his father's violence, and custody was awarded to his father. There was a period in 1948 when he lived with his mother and her family in Springfield. But ultimately, he returned to Peoria and his grandmother's household. His mother disappeared from his life when he was around 10 years old. His father died in 1968. His grandmother, Marie, died in 1978, one of the deaths that hit him hardest, because she had been the one consistent figure in a childhood with very little consistency. He described, in interviews over the years, the specific quality of growing up in that environment. The way he learned to read a room from the time he could walk. The way he absorbed the social dynamics of a working house. The way love and money and fear were all circulating in the same space. He escaped into movies. The local cinemas were one of the few places a boy could go to be somewhere else entirely. And he learned to make people laugh, which was the one skill that worked reliably in nearly every situation his world presented. His grandmother caught him performing a small show for the local kids one afternoon and, rather than punish him, enrolled him in a talent program at a community center. She saw what was there. She was the first person to recognize it formally. He was expelled from school at 14. He worked as a janitor, a meat packer, and eventually joined the army in 1958. The army, as it turned out, was not a better environment for him than Peoria. He spent much of his service in an army stockade following an altercation with a fellow soldier. He was discharged in 1960, returned to Peoria, and had a child on the way. The first marriage was about to begin. Patricia Price, The Beginning. Richard Pryor married Patricia Price in 1960 or 1961. The exact year is recorded differently in different sources, with IMDb placing the marriage date as June 11th, 1961. He was 20 years old. Their son, Richard Pryor Jr., was born on April 10th, 1962. The marriage lasted approximately 1 year, and ended in divorce in 1966 per some records, though most accounts describe it as ending very shortly after it began, a marriage that was essentially over before his son was born. Very little has been documented publicly about Patricia Price beyond the basic facts. She was not a public figure, did not give extensive interviews about the relationship, and has largely remained outside the detailed biographical record that surrounds every other aspect of Pryor's life. What is known is that she was the first wife, that the marriage was brief, and that it began at a moment when Richard was just beginning to figure out who he was and what he was capable of, which meant, practically, that she was present for the very early version of someone who was still forming rather than the fully realized force he would become. Richard Jr. grew up knowing his father, but the relationship was shaped by Richard's near-total absorption in his career, his substance use, and the general turbulence of a life that left very little consistent space for fatherhood. Richard Jr. has spoken in interviews about the specific experience of being the son of a man whose public identity was enormous and whose private attention was inconsistently available. Loving when present, but not always present. Richard Pryor left Peoria after the marriage ended and moved toward New York, where he intended to build a comedy career from nothing. He had essentially no money, no connections, and no guarantee that anyone would care what he had to say. He performed in small clubs in Greenwich Village and Harlem, worked through material night after night, slept on floors, and spent the early 1960s developing the voice that would eventually make him the most important stand-up comedian of his generation. He worshipped Bill Cosby in the very early years and consciously imitated his clean, polished style, the safe, palatable comedy that had made Cosby one of the first black comedians to cross over to mainstream white audiences in a significant way. For a while, Pryor worked in that mode, wearing it like a costume. Then, in a much-told moment at the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas in 1967, he stopped midway through a performance, looked out at the audience, and walked off stage. He had understood in that moment that the comedy he had been doing was someone else's, that it was a performance of a personality that wasn't his, and that if he was going to do this at all, he was going to have to do it from somewhere real. He went away for a period. He went to Berkeley, California, where the counterculture and the civil rights movement and the black arts movement were all happening simultaneously and loudly. He absorbed it. He came back with material that was entirely, unmistakably his own. He was also, throughout this period, developing the habits that would complicate every relationship he had. The drinking that had been part of his life since his teenage years was becoming heavier. Drug use was becoming more regular. The emotional volatility that the Peoria childhood had built into his nervous system was being amplified rather than moderated by success and by substances. And somewhere in all of it, the pattern of his relationships with women was crystallizing into something specific: intense attraction, genuine feeling, then the eruption of whatever he was carrying, and then the end. The next marriage would begin as he was reaching his first real period of fame, and it would end much sooner than it should have. Shelley Bonus, The Fame Years Begin. By 1967, Richard Pryor had built enough of a career to be performing regularly at major venues and appearing on national television programs. He had done The Ed Sullivan Show. He was being noticed and compared to Bill Cosby, whose polished, mainstream-friendly style Pryor was already consciously moving away from. Pryor wanted something rawer, more personal, more willing to look at the actual interior of a black man's life in America without softening any of it. The material he was developing would eventually become the most influential body of stand-up comedy in American history. But in 1967, it was still forming, and the man performing it was simultaneously brilliant and deeply unstable. He married Shelley Bonus in 1967. Some records place the formal beginning of the marriage in January 1968. Their daughter, Pryor, was born in July 1969, and the marriage ended not long after. Rain has written and performed about her childhood extensively, most notably in a one-woman autobiographical show that she developed and performed over many years. Her account of growing up as Richard Pryor's daughter was honest about the love alongside the pain, the way he could be warm and present, and then, in different circumstances, entirely inaccessible. She described a father who was deeply funny, genuinely curious, physically affectionate at his best. And then the drugs would shift everything. The man she knew in the warm moments was not always the man who was there. Rain also grew up navigating the specific complexity of being biracial in a period when that wasn't always comfortable. With a famous black father and a white mother, in a world that had strong and not always kind opinions about what that meant. She has been candid about those aspects of her childhood in interviews and in her autobiographical work, and her portrait of Richard Pryor as a father was full and unsparing, and also full of love. The Shelley Bonus marriage also produced one of the recurring dynamics of Pryor's personal life. He was involved with other women while married. His relationship with Maxine Anderson produced a daughter named Elizabeth Ann, born April 24, 1967, the same year he married Shelley. The children arrived across multiple simultaneous relationships, which was a pattern that would continue through most of his adult life. By this point, cocaine had entered his life in a serious way. Alcohol had always been present. The combination of genuine creative genius, enormous professional ambition, the emotional volatility that came from his childhood, and substances that stripped away whatever limited internal regulation he possessed, was producing a man who was simultaneously making some of the most important comedy of the era and methodically dismantling his personal life. He had a well-documented breakdown in Las Vegas in 1967, walking off a stage mid-performance and disappearing for a period, that was connected to both the substance use and the deeper crisis of identity he was going through about what kind of comedian he actually wanted to be. The answer he came back with, after the breakdown and a period of recalibration in Berkeley, California, where the civil rights movement and the black arts movement were happening simultaneously and loudly, was the comedy of his actual life. Not the polished imitation of Bill Cosby, not the safe material that crossed over to white audiences without friction. The comedy of the brothel, and the grandmother, and the father, and the fear, and the drugs, and the specific experience of being a black man in America, told with an honesty that the industry and much of the audience had never encountered before. That Nigger's Crazy, in 1974. Is it something I said? In 1975. Bicentennial Nigger in 1976, which won a Grammy Award. These albums were rewriting what stand-up comedy could be, how personal it could get, how honest, how willing to examine the interior of a life without softening the edges for anyone's comfort. The live concert film, Richard Pryor, Live in Concert, was released in 1979 and is considered by many comedy scholars to be the single greatest stand-up comedy performance ever recorded. The divorces and the arrests were the tabloid story. The comedy was the actual story. They were inseparable from each other because the same damage that fueled the work's honesty was the damage that made his personal life so consistently difficult. After Shelley, there was a period before the next official marriage. But those years were packed with relationships, affairs, and a nearly uninterrupted stream of personal chaos that made the marriages themselves look almost tidy by comparison. One of the most significant non-marital relationships of his life happened in 1977. Pam Grier, Deborah Maguire, and the chaos of 1977. Pam Grier was, in 1977, one of the most celebrated actresses in America, known primarily for her roles in the action films of the early 1970s that had made her a cultural phenomenon. She and Pryor were cast together in Greased Lightning that year, and what developed between them was genuine and intense. Grier has spoken about the relationship with a combination of affection and clear-eyed honesty. She loved him. She recognized that he was damaged in specific and deep ways, and she tried to help him, most notably helping him work through reading difficulties connected to his complicated educational history, sitting with him and going through material patiently in ways that the biographies of both of them have noted. She saw who he was underneath the performances and the substances. She was also, as she eventually acknowledged, unable to save him from himself. That is not a criticism of her effort. It is a description of his condition. While he was in a relationship with Pam Grier, he married someone else. Deborah Maguire was an actress and model whom Pryor had been involved with on and off for roughly 4 years before they married on September 22, 1977. She was described by people who knew them as genuinely in love with him, someone who accepted the difficult parts of who he was because the man she experienced at his best was remarkable. She was not uninformed about the territory she was entering. She knew about the drug use. She knew about the volatility. She entered anyway. The marriage to Maguire lasted approximately 4 months before one of the most dramatically public incidents of his personal life. On New Year's Eve of 1977, a party at their Northridge home ended in spectacular fashion. An argument erupted, guests began leaving, and Pryor, in a state of chemically fueled agitation, took his gun outside and fired multiple rounds into the cars of guests who were still in his driveway. The cars were empty by the time he started shooting, as most of the party had already scattered. But the sound of gunfire in a residential neighborhood at midnight on New Year's Eve was enough to bring the police. He was arrested on charges of assault with a deadly weapon. The charges were eventually reduced, and the legal proceedings unfolded across 1978. But the incident was widely covered and became one of the defining public images of his personal chaos. Not because it was the worst thing that ever happened in his private life, but because it was the most visible, the kind of thing that ended up on the news and in the papers, and that people remembered decades later. He later told People magazine that he didn't know why he did self-destructive things like that he wanted to learn from his mistakes. It was a statement that was, by all accounts, entirely sincere. The wanting to learn was real. The learning itself was considerably more difficult. Maguire's account of the marriage, given to People shortly after their separation, described the fundamental problem with precision. Richard Pryor couldn't argue. He would let things accumulate until the pressure became unbearable, and then he would explode. A lot of things were said in anger that were going to be very hard to smooth over. The divorce was finalized in August 1978, and she subsequently filed suit against him in connection with events of their time together. What was happening in parallel, underneath all of the personal chaos, was the comedy, That Nigger's Crazy, in 1974. Is It Something I Said? In 1975. Bicentennial Nigger in 1976, which won a Grammy Award. These albums were rewriting what stand-up comedy could be, how personal it could get, how honest, how willing to examine the interior of a black man's experience in America without softening the edges for anyone. The live concert film Richard Pryor, Live in Concert, was released in 1979 and is considered by many comedy scholars to be the single greatest stand-up comedy performance ever recorded. The divorces and the arrests were the tabloid story. The comedy was the actual story. They were inseparable from each other because the same damage that fueled the work's honesty was the damage that made his personal life so consistently difficult. The next woman who would try to love him was someone he hired to decorate his house. Jennifer Lee, The First Time and the Fire. Jennifer Lee was an actress and interior designer. Richard Pryor hired her to redecorate his home sometime around 1980, and in the proximity of that professional arrangement, something genuine developed between them. She was sharp, direct, and capable of holding her own with someone whose force of personality tended to dominate every room he occupied. She understood what she was getting into, at least intellectually. Understanding and living are different things. She moved into his world at the worst possible time, in the worst possible way. In June 1980, Richard Pryor set himself on fire at his home in Northridge, California. The circumstances of exactly what happened that night have been described in various ways over the years. Pryor himself told the story differently at different moments, sometimes framing it as a freebasing accident, and sometimes implying, in darker and more candid moments, that something more intentional may have been happening inside him that night. What is documented by the medical record is that he was badly burned, burns covering more than half of his body, and that he ran down Parthenia Street in the San Fernando Valley with his clothing on fire before being stopped and helped by passing motorists. He was hospitalized at the Grossman Burn Center at Sherman Oaks Hospital, where he spent 6 weeks undergoing treatment that included skin grafts and reconstruction. The physical ordeal left him permanently changed in his relationship with his own body. He recovered, and he made comedy about it, which was, for Richard Pryor, the only available response to any experience he actually survived. His 1982 concert film, Richard Pryor, Live on the Sunset Strip, included a sequence about the fire that became one of the most celebrated pieces in his catalogue. The moment when he described the experience of burning and then running, told with such specific and fearless honesty that audiences watching it simultaneously felt they were witnessing something deeply personal and laughing harder than they had any right to. The bit about the burning match and what it said to him in that moment has been analysed and quoted and performed as an example of what comedy can do when it's operating at its highest level. He and Jennifer Lee married in August 1981, approximately a year after the fire. By all accounts, she entered the marriage with genuine love and genuine awareness of the territory. She was not naive about who he was. She had watched the public record. She had seen the chaos. She chose him anyway, which says something about both her capacity for love and what she saw in him that was worth choosing. The marriage lasted approximately 14 months. They divorced in October 1982. The stated reason was his drug addiction, which had not abated. The freebasing that had led to the fire was not a one-time event, but the continuation of a pattern, and the sustained presence of that pattern inside a marriage made the marriage impossible to sustain. Jennifer Lee later described the experience with characteristic directness. The addiction was the third person in the marriage, and it took up all the room. But she did not disappear from his life. She remained connected to him in the years that followed, not as a wife, not exactly as a friend, but as someone who was woven into who he was in ways that outlasted the official designation. She would return. He would need her. In the meantime, there were more relationships and more marriages ahead, including a woman he would marry twice in rapid succession. Flynn Belaine, Twice Around. Flynn Belaine was an aspiring actress when she came into Richard Pryor's life in the mid-1980s. Their relationship began before any official commitment, and in November 1984, she gave birth to their son, Stephen, 2 full years before they formalized anything. The child arrived into the world of a man who was already a father multiple times over, in various configurations of involvement and distance. The first marriage to Flynn Belaine took place in October 1986. It ended after approximately 2 months. Flynn filed for divorce, then withdrew the petition, a sequence that suggests the relationship had the specific quality of something that neither party could fully commit to ending, even when they were trying to. The on and off nature of what they had was built into the structure of how they operated. The divorce was finalized in July 1987. While all of this was happening, the filing, the withdrawal, the finalization, Richard Pryor fathered a son with another woman. Franklin Pryor was born in April 1987 to a woman named Geraldine Mason, making him the child of a relationship that overlapped with the marriage to Flynn. Franklin arrived 3 months before the divorce from Flynn was finalized, which provided a very specific timeline of events that speaks for itself. Flynn Belaine gave birth to their daughter Kelsey in October 1987 after the divorce was finalized. So the second child she shared with Richard arrived after they were legally separated. This is the kind of biographical detail that requires no editorial commentary. The facts carry their own weight. Richard Pryor and Flynn Belaine remarried on April 1st, 1990. The date carries its own irony. The second marriage lasted roughly 15 months, ending in July 1991. The reconciliation and the second dissolution followed the same basic arc as the first, with neither version of the marriage lasting long enough to resolve whatever it was that kept pulling them together and driving them apart. In 1986, Richard Pryor was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. He did not announce it publicly until 1991, meaning he lived with that knowledge for 5 years, privately, while continuing to make films, marry and divorce Flynn twice, and manage the steady physical deterioration that the disease was beginning to produce. The timing of the diagnosis, coming at a moment when the cumulative physical toll of his life was already significant, meant that the MS was entering a body that had already been through the fire and the drugs and the fundamental damage of decades lived at maximum intensity. By the early 1990s, he was no longer capable of the physical dynamism that had always been part of his performance. The disease was advancing. His last stand-up special had been in 1983. The film career continued through the late 1980s and early 1990s. Jojo Dancer, Your Life is Calling, in 1986, which he directed and which was autobiographical in a way that his public had come to expect. Moving in 1988, Harlem Nights in 1989. But the work was increasingly dependent on his name and his presence, rather than the full expression of the force he had once been. He suffered a heart attack in 1990, the same year he remarried Flynn for the second time. He underwent triple bypass surgery. His body was telling him something in increasingly urgent terms about the cost of how he had lived, and he was finally, in a different way than before, running out of the capacity to ignore it. The marriages had ended. The career was in a different register. And Jennifer Lee was still in his life, in the way that people who are truly connected to us remain present even when the official relationship has concluded. Jennifer Lee, the final chapter. Richard Pryor and Jennifer Lee remarried on June 29, 2001. He was 60 years old. She was 53. The multiple sclerosis had advanced significantly by this point. He used a wheelchair for mobility, required substantial assistance with daily life, and the man who had dominated stages and screens and the imagination of American comedy for 4 decades was now living with the particular, relentless humbling of a progressive neurological disease. The decision to remarry him was, by Jennifer's own account, not a complicated one. She had loved him since 1980. The intervening 20 years had not dissolved that. She had watched the Flynn Belaine marriages happen. She had watched his health deteriorate. She had remained connected to him in various ways through all of it. When the question finally resolved itself into whether she would be the one beside him for whatever remained, she said yes without apparent hesitation. She managed his care, his affairs, and his legacy with a ferocity that became itself a defining characteristic of the final years of his life. She was his primary caregiver. She made decisions about his public representation. She gave interviews on his behalf when he was no longer able to give them himself. She was, in the truest practical sense, the person who kept the machinery of his life running during the years when he could not run it himself. The marriage was also, by the accounts of those who visited and knew them in those years, genuinely warm, not a duty, not a business arrangement. Richard in a wheelchair, Jennifer beside him, the two of them watching films or having conversations or simply being in the same room. People who saw them together described something real rather than something performed. The chaos that had defined the first marriage in 1981 was gone, replaced by the specific intimacy of two people who had known each other a long time and understood each other in ways that didn't require explanation. She also became, after his death, a controversial figure in the management of his estate and his legacy. She had strong views about what recordings should be released, which projects should be approved, and how his work should be presented to new generations. Those views put her in conflict with his adult children and other members of his family at various points, and the disputes generated press coverage and legal proceedings. The ferocity with which she protected what she considered his legacy was not always appreciated by the people who also had a claim on it. But the ferocity came from love rather than from calculation, and the distinction matters. Richard Pryor had a significant heart attack in 1990 and survived. He had another in 2005. On December 10th, 2005, 9 days after his 65th birthday, he had a third and final heart attack at his Los Angeles home. Jennifer was present. She attempted to revive him before emergency services arrived. He was transported to a hospital and pronounced dead at 7:58 in the morning. He was 65 years old. He had been married 7 times. He had 6 surviving children. He had made some of the most important comedy in the history of the form, and he had been, by the accounting of almost every person who had loved him, one of the most difficult human beings any of them had ever known. What the marriages meant. Richard Pryor's biographer, Scott Saul, who wrote Becoming Richard Pryor, offered a description of the pattern in his relationships that was precise and unsentimental. The closer women came to him, the more ugliness they often experienced. Just as he had lived in fear growing up, he had learned in childhood that love and harm were tangled together, and he never quite managed to separate them in his adult relationships. That was the inheritance of the brothel on North Washington Street in Peoria, of the grandmother who loved him and hit him, of the parents who left. This is not a defense of any harm done to anyone. The women who were close to him experienced real things, real fear, real legal proceedings, real scars that did not require psychological explanation to be taken seriously. Patricia Price, who was married to him before anyone outside Peoria had ever heard of him, and raised their son largely without him while he went and became a legend. Shelley Bonus, who gave him reign and navigated the impossible territory of being close to him as his career exploded into something neither of them had fully anticipated. Deborah Maguire, who watched him fire a gun into empty cars on New Year's Eve, and then went to court over what had happened in their time together, and who told People magazine afterward that Richard Pryor just couldn't argue, that he would wait until something got under his skin so badly that he blew up, and that a lot of things had been said in anger that were going to be very hard to smooth over. Jennifer Lee, who married him in 1981 with full knowledge of the territory and discovered that full knowledge and daily experience are not the same thing, who then left and came back 20 years later, because whatever he was, she couldn't stay away from it. Flynn Belaine, who married him twice and had 2 children with him, and navigated the specific chaos of a man who was fathering a child with someone else while they were married. Each of these women entered the relationship knowing something about the difficulty and discovered more once they were inside it. What they also all apparently encountered was something real at the center of Richard Pryor, that the performances and the substances and the volatility were partly covering and partly expressing. His comedy was autobiographical in the most literal sense. He told stories on stage about his grandmother's brothel, about his father, about his marriages, about the fire, about the drugs, about race and love and death and fear. He told all of it because all of it was true, because he had no other mode of processing his experience than to hold it up to the light in front of an audience and see what it looked like. And what it looked like, in his hands, was the most honest comedy that anyone had produced. The 7 marriages were part of that autobiography. They were the record of a man who wanted connection with a kind of desperation that went back to the 10-year-old boy who was left behind in Peoria, who grew up in a house where love was available but always conditional, always tangled up with something else, always subject to withdrawal without warning. He kept trying to build something stable with other people. He kept finding that the damage he carried was too deep and too active to allow it. He was also, in the spaces between the wreckage, genuinely capable of love. The people who knew him when the substances were not overwhelming him described someone warm and perceptive and unexpectedly gentle. Funny in private in a way that was different from the stage version, curious about people, physically affectionate in the particular way of someone who grew up with very little reliable physical warmth. Rain Pryor's account of her father made room for both the difficulty and the love, because both were real and present, and neither one cancels the other. Jennifer Lee's decision to come back in 2001 was not made by someone who had forgotten what happened in 1982. It was made by someone who had weighed the full account and chosen him anyway, because the full account also included everything he was at his best, and that was worth something that couldn't be easily named. He made Richard Pryor live in concert in 1979, which many scholars of comedy consider the single greatest stand-up performance ever committed to film. He made Live on the Sunset Strip in 1982, in which he described setting himself on fire with such precise and fearless honesty that the audience didn't know whether to laugh or cry, and ended up doing both simultaneously. He made Here and Now in 1983, his last major stand-up special, which showed a man already beginning to feel the approach of physical limits he couldn't perform his way out of. Between those 3 films, captured at different points in a decade of extraordinary chaos, was the full portrait of what he was. A man who could take the worst thing that had ever happened to him and make an audience feel it and laugh at it and understand something they hadn't understood before. These were the actual stakes of the story, not just who he married and when, but what he was making while all of it was happening, what the damage cost him and what he made from the cost. Every marriage produced more material. Every divorce produced more material. The fire produced material that millions of people have watched and laughed at and been moved by for decades. The suffering was real, and the art made from the suffering was real, and the 2 facts exist simultaneously without either one diminishing the other. The comedy scholar and biographer Scott Saul described Pryor's personal life and his professional life as inseparable, that you could not understand why the comedy was so extraordinary without understanding what was fueling it, and you could not understand the chaos of his private life without understanding that the same raw, undefended access to his own experience that made the comedy devastating was also the thing that made him impossible to be safely close to. He couldn't put up walls for the comedy and walls for the relationships at the same time. He was either open or closed, and when he was open, everything came through. Richard Pryor grew up in a brothel in Peoria and couldn't finish a marriage for most of his adult life, and set himself on fire and hurt people he loved and made them laugh and made America think more clearly about race and pain and humanity than almost anyone before him. He died on a December morning in Los Angeles with his wife beside him, having tried to save him. She was the woman he had married first in 1981 and again in 2001. The one he kept coming back to. The one who kept coming back to him. 7 marriages. One love story interrupted. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.